American-based bank for this.
IndyMac specialized in so-called Alt-A mortgages, which didn't require borrowers to provide documentation on their incomes. Exactly the kind of mortgages that Fannie Mae began issuing in huge numbers to provide, quote, affordable housing. By then, it was clear that the biggest sources of trouble in the system, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, were also in huge trouble themselves. Warren Buffett was even approached to see if he would get involved in saving them, but opted out, saying, quote, "The scale of help is such that I don't think it can come from the private sector." And the claims from politicians that there was no problem were replaced with a realization that taxpayers were about to be put on the hook.
World markets are surging this morning on word of that federal takeover of the mortgage giants Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac.
September 7th, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are taken over by the Federal Housing Finance Agency, with the Treasury loaning $200 billion. Even though the main pillars of the disaster had been pulled down, others kept crashing. A week after Fannie and Freddie's downfall, the world's largest brokerage firm, Merrill Lynch, fearing a liquidity meltdown, is sold to Bank of America for $50 billion.
We thought this was the strategic opportunity of a lifetime.
That same day,
Lehman Brothers is filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy.
But there was no merger or bailout for the venerable investment bank Lehman Brothers, which posted a $2.8 billion loss in the second quarter 2008 and had some $60 billion in mortgage-backed securities, double its capital on the books. It was the largest Chapter 11 bankruptcy in U.S. history.
The stock market Monday experiencing its steepest drop since the September 11th attacks.
September 16th, a day after Lehman's collapse, the Federal Reserve stepped in to save giant insurer AIG with an $85 billion emergency loan in return for an 80% stake in the company. AIG invested billions of dollars in subprime mortgages and had lost $13 billion in the first half of 2008.
The Dow dropping more than 400 points even after the government announced its plan to rescue AIG.
September 17th, the stock prices for the last two big investment banks, Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs, took a nosedive. The SEC stepped in and halted short selling of stocks, saving both, which later transformed into bank holding companies. With the entire financial world in a total meltdown, something far bigger than piecemeal salvation was required. September 21st, Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson unveils an historic $700 billion bailout plan.
This needs to be big enough to make a real difference and get at the heart of the problem.
Coming up, talk about a hard sell, a bailout with a price tag approaching $1 trillion. Banks collapsing, a government rescue plan, Wall Street and Washington in a whipsaw. How the biggest financial story in a long time turned into a political drama. Chief White House correspondent Bret Baier reports from Washington.
Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson came up with a plan where the government would back up $700 billion in mortgage-related assets. But the devil was going to be in the details. The administration argued that a bailout was inevitable.
And it may make you angry. It makes me angry. When you ask about the taxpayers being on the hook, guess what? They're already on the hook.
But there were quite a few House Republicans who did not entirely agree. For one thing, they balked at the idea of giving the government, even a Republican Treasury Secretary, a blank taxpayer check without an independent body looking over his shoulder. For another thing, they had strong objections to some goodies that the Democrats had stuck in the bill.
So they wanted, for example, to have $20 billion ultimately go to Acorn and other left-wing groups out of tax money.
President Bush appeared on national television to lobby for the bailout.
We are in the midst of a serious financial crisis, and the federal government is responding with decisive action. Tomorrow morning, I'll suspend my campaign and return to Washington.
Meanwhile, John McCain came to Washington to work on the plan.
The most important thing McCain did was he legitimized John Boehner and the House Republicans. I think that there would have been an effort to run over them. McCain then, in effect, empowered the House Republicans.
On September 25th, McCain and Barack Obama, along with congressional leaders from both parties, met with President Bush at the White House.
The Democrats, I'm confident, walked into that meeting convinced that they had a deal, that the administration was going to give them the money they wanted as the price for getting the money the administration wanted. And when they went around the room, and I think it was very interesting in the seating, that John Boehner, the Republican House leader, was sitting next to John McCain. When they got to John Boehner, Boehner said, you know, the House Republicans aren't going to go along. We're not going to agree to give $20 billion to left-wing groups. We're not going to agree to all the extra spending. We're not going to agree to doing this without very strict controls. And McCain simply said, I'm with Boehner.
There was a popular revolt against this $700 billion rescue package. Calls were running to members of Congress offices, 10 to 1, 100 to 1, I was told, in one office. I mean, there was a lot of anger because there was a feeling that this was a rescue of